All right, so picture this. It's 1986, and somewhere in a Caterpillar engineering facility in Peoria, Illinois, a group of engineers are staring at a problem that's been haunting American agriculture for decades: the soil. Specifically, what heavy equipment does to it. See, here's the thing about modern farming that nobody really talks about. The machines got bigger, way bigger. Tractors that once weighed maybe 10 or 12,000 pounds in the 1950s were pushing 30, 40, even 50,000 pounds by the mid-80s. And all that weight, sitting on 4 rubber tires, was doing something terrible to the soil: compaction. Now, soil compaction, it doesn't sound dramatic, right? But listen, when you compress soil under extreme pressure, you're collapsing all those tiny air pockets that roots need to grow. You're crushing the structure that allows water to drain properly. You're creating hardpan layers 18, 24 inches down that plant roots just can't penetrate. And the worst part? Once you compact soil like that, it can take years, sometimes decades, to recover naturally. Farmers knew this, agronomists knew this, equipment manufacturers knew this. Everyone knew it. But the problem was, you needed those big tractors. Modern farming demanded power. You needed to pull 12-row planters, 30-foot cultivators, massive grain carts. The work required weight and horsepower. It was a trap, really. The very machines farmers needed to be productive were destroying the productivity of their land. Caterpillar now, they'd been watching this from the sidelines. See, Cat had always been a construction company. Dozers, excavators, loaders, that sort of thing. Yellow iron, as they called it. They'd built their reputation on tracks, continuous rubber or steel tracks that distributed weight across a much larger surface area than wheels ever could. It was basic physics. More contact area meant less pounds per square inch on the ground. But here's where it gets interesting. In the early 80s, Caterpillar started asking a question that seemed almost, obvious in hindsight. If tracks worked so well in construction, if they could handle bulldozers weighing 60, 80, even 100 tons without tearing up the ground the way wheels would, why couldn't that same technology work in agriculture? Now, this wasn't the first time someone had thought of tracked tractors for farming, not even close. You had the old Caterpillar 10 and 15 models back in the 1920s and 30s, those classic crawlers that helped settle the American West. You had military surplus stuff after World War II, but those machines, they were slow, really slow. 3, maybe 4 miles per hour at best. And they rode like a tank, because that's essentially what they were. Steel tracks on steel wheels with no suspension to speak of. Try spending 12 hours a day on one of those things and see how your spine feels. So tracked tractors for farming, they'd been tried, and they'd largely been abandoned by the 1960s because conventional wheeled tractors were just more practical for most operations. Faster, more comfortable, easier to maintain, better for road transport. But Caterpillar, they had something different in mind, something that had been quietly developing in their construction equipment division. Rubber tracks, not steel. Rubber. Belts, essentially, reinforced with steel cables and nylon, with aggressive tread patterns molded right in. These tracks had been showing up on compact excavators and skid steers, and they were proving something important. You could have the flotation benefits of tracks, that low ground pressure that protected the soil, without the bone-rattling ride, without the 3-mile-per-hour speed limit, without tearing up paved roads or concrete. So the more Caterpillar's ag division looked at the numbers, the more excited they got. A rubber-tracked vehicle could achieve ground pressures down around 6 or 5 pounds per square inch compared to 12, 15, sometimes 20 psi for a big 4WD tractor with duals. That's less than half the pressure. In some soil conditions, it was like walking on snow in boots versus snowshoes. You just didn't sink. And here's the kicker. Those rubber tracks, they could handle speeds up to 20, even 25 miles an hour. Not crawler speed, real road speed. You could actually drive the thing between fields without holding up traffic or shaking your teeth loose. So in 1986, Caterpillar made a decision. They were going into agriculture. Not with a conventional tractor, not with something safe and predictable. They were going to bet big on rubber track technology, on this radical idea that you could build a tractor that didn't look like any other tractor on the market, didn't work like any other tractor, but could do the job better because it solved this fundamental problem that everyone else was just, well, accepting. They called it the Challenger. And when the first prototype emerged, when farmers got their first look at this thing, well, reactions were, let's say, mixed. The Challenger 65, the first production model, it hit the market in 1987. And right away, you could tell this thing was different. Not just in how it looked, though, yeah, it definitely looked different. Those massive rubber tracks where wheels should be. The bright Caterpillar yellow paint scheme that screamed construction equipment, not farm equipment. The whole design language was just not what farmers were used to. But the real difference was in how it worked. Caterpillar had engineered this thing from the ground up around the track system. The MT65, that's what they designated it, Mobile Track 65. It was packing a 348 horsepower Cat 3400 diesel, big inline six-cylinder engine, turbocharged, intercooled, all the good stuff, paired with a power shift transmission that gave you 10 forward speeds and 2 reverse. Now, 348 horses doesn't sound revolutionary, right? John Deere had tractors in that power range. Case did. International Harvester did. But here's what made the Challenger different. All that power, all that torque, it was going through tracks that were 25 inches wide and 120 inches long, each track. That's over 6,000 square inches of contact area total when you did the math. A conventional four-wheel drive tractor with the same horsepower, even running duals, you were lucky to get half that. The engineering of the track system itself, that's where Caterpillar really showed what they knew from decades of construction equipment development. These weren't simple belts. Each track was built up in layers. You had a steel cable core running the length of the belt for tensile strength, because you're talking about forces that would just rip regular rubber apart. Over that, you had nylon reinforcement layers, crisscrossed for dimensional stability. Then the rubber compound itself, formulated specifically to resist cutting, chunking, and weather cracking. And the tread pattern, those big aggressive lugs, they were molded in with precise spacing to match the pitch of the drive sprocket and the roller system. Speaking of which, the undercarriage on these things was pure Caterpillar DNA. You had a drive sprocket at the rear, an idler wheel at the front to maintain tension, and in between a whole series of mid-rollers, 7 on each side, that supported the track and distributed the machine's weight. Each roller was mounted on a sealed bearing system, and the whole suspension setup used torsion bars and shock absorbers to actually give the thing a decent ride. Remember, this was the mid-80s. Most farm tractors still had essentially no suspension. You felt every bump, every furrow, every rock. The Challenger, it actually tried to isolate the operator from all that. The cab, too, that was a step up from what most farmers were used to. Pressurized, heated, air-conditioned, sound insulation, a comfortable seat with actual adjustments. Caterpillar was used to building equipment for professional operators who spent 10, 12-hour days in the seat, and they brought that mentality to the Challenger. But here's the thing that really mattered, the thing that made farmers stop and think: the field performance. Because all the engineering in the world doesn't mean much if it can't do the work. And the Challenger? It could do the work. In loose, sandy soils where wheeled tractors would spin and dig themselves down, the Challenger just walked right through. The tracks distributed the weight so evenly that you couldn't really spin them if you tried. In heavy, sticky clay conditions where a big four-wheel drive would pack ruts 6, 8 inches deep, the Challenger left tracks so shallow you could barely see them after one pass. Spring tillage, when the ground was still soft and wet, that's where the thing really showed its advantage. You could get into fields days, sometimes weeks earlier than conventional equipment without causing damage. Fuel efficiency was another surprise. Because you weren't losing power to slippage, because the tracks had such positive engagement with the soil, the Challenger could pull the same implement as a four-wheel drive tractor rated 10–20% higher in horsepower.
Caterpillar claimed you could do the same work as a 450-horse wheeled tractor with their 348-horse tracked machine. And in real-world testing, a lot of farmers found that, yeah, that was pretty accurate. The early adopters, the guys who bought Challengers in '87, '88, and '89, they became evangelists for the platform. They'd show their neighbors the difference in soil structure, the lack of compaction, the improved root penetration in crops growing in tracked wheel paths versus regular wheel paths. Some of them got, honestly, a little obsessive about it, digging up side-by-side comparisons, measuring bulk density with penetrometers, documenting yield differences. In Caterpillar, they started expanding the line pretty quickly. The MT65 was just the beginning. In 1989, they introduced the MT75, essentially the same platform but with a bigger 3,408 cubic inch engine making 415 horsepower. Then came the MT85 and MT95 in the early 90s, pushing the power range up to 460, even 500 horses. But here's where the story starts to get complicated. Because while Caterpillar was building this new business, while they were proving the technology worked, while they were winning over customers one farm at a time, they were also stepping into a market that already had very established players who didn't appreciate the new competition.
Now, the thing you need to understand about the agricultural equipment industry in the late 80s is that it was already a pretty brutal business. You had John Deere, the absolute giant, the green machine that dominated market share like nobody else. You had Case IH, formed from the merger of two historic brands, trying to compete on scale. You had AGCO, which was quietly buying up struggling brands like White and Massey Ferguson and building a portfolio. These companies, they'd all been through the farm crisis of the early 80s, when equipment sales collapsed and farmers went bankrupt by the thousands. They'd learned to fight tooth and nail for every percentage point of market share. And here comes Caterpillar, this construction equipment company, waltzing into their market with a weird-looking tracked tractor that they claimed was better than the conventional machines everyone had been building for decades. The reaction from the competition was, let's call it skeptical. Publicly, they downplayed the Challenger. Tracks are a niche solution, they'd say. Maybe good for specific soil conditions, but not practical for general farming. Too expensive, too complicated, too specialized. Privately, though, they were worried, because the Challenger was getting traction, pun sort of intended, in some very important market segments. The Great Plains, that's where the Challenger really found its home. North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Kansas, Nebraska. Big farms, really big farms, often operating on heavy clay soils that were prone to compaction. These guys were running massive tractors already, four-wheel drives with 450, 500 horsepower, pulling 60-foot cultivators or air seeders, and they were dealing with compaction problems that legitimately hurt their yields. For these guys, the Challenger wasn't just a novelty, it was a solution to a real economic problem. If you could reduce compaction enough to improve yields even by 2, 3, 5 bushels per acre across several thousand acres, that was real money. Money that would pay for the premium price Caterpillar was charging for the Challenger. And Caterpillar was charging a premium. These things weren't cheap. An MT70 in the early 90s would run you close to $200,000 easy. That was 50, 60, even 80,000 more than a comparable wheeled tractor from Deere or Case. But Cat's pitch was you're not buying a tractor. You're buying better soil health, better yields, lower fuel costs, and a machine that'll last. And that last part, the durability, that was pure Caterpillar. These things were built heavy, really heavy. The main frame was welded steel box construction, basically a bridge under the sheet metal. The engine, transmission, final drives, all of it was rated for continuous heavy-duty use. The tracks themselves, with proper maintenance, could go 4, 5, even 6,000 hours before needing replacement. Compare that to tires on a big four-wheel drive that might last 2, 3,000 hours if you were lucky. John Deere watched all this happening, and they didn't like it one bit. Deere had tried tracked tractors themselves way back, the old MC and MT crawler models in the 40s and 50s, but they'd abandoned that path when wheeled tractors became dominant. Now here was Caterpillar proving there was a market for tracks after all, and it was a market Deere wanted. So in 1999, John Deere announced their own tracked tractor, the 8000 T Series, and it was pretty clearly inspired by the Challenger. Rubber tracks, similar undercarriage design, power in the same range as the Challenger line. Deere had seen Caterpillar's homework and decided to, study from it.
Case IH did the same thing, partnering with Cat's track system supplier to develop their own quad track system. 4 triangular tracks, one at each corner, instead of the Challenger's 2 long tracks. Different approach, same basic goal: better flotation, less compaction, more productivity. Suddenly, the market Caterpillar had pioneered, the market they'd spent a decade developing and educating farmers about, was getting crowded. And this is where being the construction equipment company trying to play in agriculture started to become a problem. See, John Deere had 10,000 dealers across North America. Caterpillar maybe had a couple hundred ag dealers, mostly former Challenger dealers they'd acquired when they bought up smaller companies. Deere had parts infrastructure everywhere. Caterpillar was still building theirs out. Deere had decades of relationships with farmers, generations of loyalty, green blood as they called it. Caterpillar was the new guy, the outsider. And there was another issue, something more fundamental. Caterpillar's core business was construction equipment. That's where they made their real money, where they had global market dominance, where their brand meant something. Agriculture, even with the Challenger's success, was a fraction of Caterpillar's total revenue, a small fraction. And small fractions of giant companies, they don't always get the investment and attention they need to compete. By the late 90s, Caterpillar was facing a choice: double down on agriculture, invest billions to build out dealer networks and product lines, and really compete with Deere and Case on their home turf, or find a different path. In 1997, they made a move that seemed smart at the time. They partnered with Kloss, the big German agricultural equipment manufacturer. Kloss would distribute Challenger tractors in Europe. Caterpillar would get Kloss combines and other equipment to sell through their North American dealer network. It looked like a win-win. 2 strong brands, complementary products, shared resources. But partnerships, they're tricky things, especially when the partners have different priorities.
By the year 2000, Caterpillar's agriculture division was at a crossroads. The Challenger line was successful, no question about that. They'd sold thousands of units, proven the rubber track concept, built a loyal customer base. But they weren't growing the way they needed to. Market share was stuck in the single digits, and now they had John Deere and Case breathing down their necks with competing tracked tractors. The partnership with Kloss, which had looked so promising on paper, was getting complicated in practice. Cultural differences, disagreements about product development, questions about who controlled what in which markets. Caterpillar wanted to expand beyond just tracked tractors into the full line of agricultural equipment: combines, sprayers, planters, the whole portfolio. But that required massive investment, and it meant competing directly with everyone in the industry, not just in the high horsepower tractor segment. Inside Caterpillar corporate headquarters in Peoria, people were asking harder questions. Is agriculture really core to what we do? Are we better off focusing resources on construction equipment, mining trucks, diesel engines, power generation, all the things where we're the global leader? Can we ever really compete with John Deere in their backyard? The ag division was profitable, but not hugely profitable. Margins in agriculture were tight, always had been. Farmers negotiated hard, played manufacturers against each other, waited for end-of-season discounts. It wasn't like selling a mining truck to a copper company or a bulldozer to a road contractor. Different business, different dynamics. And there was something else happening, something that would fundamentally change Caterpillar's thinking. They were in the middle of a major strategic shift, focusing on something they called enterprise strategy. The idea was to look at each business unit and ask, where can we be number 1 or number 2 globally? Where do we have sustainable competitive advantage? Where should we invest for the next 20, 30 years? In construction equipment, the answer was clear. Caterpillar was number 1, had been for decades, would be for decades to come. In agriculture, even with the successful Challenger program, they were number 6, maybe 7, depending on how you counted. And there was no realistic path to the top 3, not without spending billions they weren't sure would ever pay back. So conversations started happening. Quiet at first, then more serious. What if we found a partner who could take the Challenger brand and really grow it? Someone who's committed to agriculture as their core business. Someone who has the dealer network and the product portfolio and the industry relationships we don't. AGCO, the company that had been quietly assembling an ag brand portfolio, they started to look interesting. AGCO had Massey Ferguson, they had Fendt from Germany, they had Challenger combines already through a licensing deal. They were building a global agricultural equipment company through acquisition and strategic growth.
and they didn't have a rubber track tractor in their lineup. Negotiations began in late 2001. By May of 2002, the deal was done. Caterpillar sold its entire agricultural equipment business to AGCO for about $500 million. All the Challenger intellectual property, the manufacturing facilities, the dealer network, the product line, everything. AGCO got a proven tracked brand and the technology to compete with John Deere and Case. Caterpillar got cash and the ability to focus on what they did best. For Caterpillar, it made sense on the spreadsheet. They could exit a business where they were a small player, where the competitive landscape was getting tougher, where the investment requirements were only going to grow. They could redeploy that capital into construction equipment, into mining, into engines and power systems, into markets where they had dominant positions and better margins. But for the people who'd built the Challenger program, for the engineers who'd spent 15 years developing the technology, for the dealers and sales reps who evangelized rubber tracks to skeptical farmers, it was complicated. Pride, disappointment, frustration. They'd created something genuinely innovative, something that changed agriculture, and now it was being sold off like a used piece of equipment. The farmers who'd bought Challengers, they were worried too. What happens to parts support, to warranty service, to future product development? AGCO promised continuity, promised they'd keep investing in the Challenger brand. But promises are easy to make and harder to keep. And here's the really interesting part, the part that makes you wonder what might have been. The Challenger technology, that rubber track system Caterpillar pioneered, it didn't just influence agriculture. It ended up coming back to construction equipment in a big way. Today, compact track loaders, they're everywhere on job sites, using the exact same principles the Challenger developed. Rubber tracks for flotation and traction, speeds fast enough to be productive, ride quality good enough for all-day operation. Caterpillar themselves, they make some of the best compact track loaders in the business now. The D-Series machines, the 299, the 289, these things owe their existence to the lessons learned in the Challenger program. The rubber compound formulations, the undercarriage designs, the tread patterns, all of it was refined and proven on those agricultural tractors in North Dakota wheat fields and Iowa corn ground. So Caterpillar didn't really abandon track technology. They just decided to focus it where they had competitive advantage: construction equipment, not agriculture.
So what happened after the sale? Well, AGCO, to their credit, they did invest in Challenger. They kept the product line going. They introduced new models. They built out the dealer network. The Challenger brand, it's still around today, still making rubber-tracked tractors. In fact, the technology has only gotten better. Modern Challengers have continuously variable transmissions, GPS auto steer, telematics, all the precision agriculture technology that's become standard in the industry. But here's the thing that's interesting to think about. What if Caterpillar had stayed in? What if they'd committed to agriculture the way they committed to mining or construction? Could they have become a major player? It's hard to say. The agricultural equipment industry is tough, really tough. You need patience, long-term thinking, willingness to accept lower margins than other industries. You need to build relationships with multi-generational farming families who remember when your sales rep's grandfather sold their grandfather a tractor. That's not Cat's culture. Cat's culture is industrial. It's about selling equipment to professional operators and fleet managers who make purchasing decisions based on life cycle costs and uptime guarantees. And the timing of Caterpillar's exit, you could argue it was actually smart. By 2002, the innovation of rubber tracks had been, well, not copied exactly, but adopted by the competition. John Deere's tracked tractors were getting better. Case's quad track system was proving popular. The competitive advantage Caterpillar had enjoyed in the early 90s was eroding, and the investment required to stay competitive, to expand into combines and planters and the full product range, that was only going to grow. From a business strategy standpoint, the sale made sense. Focus on your core strengths, exit markets where you can't win, redeploy capital to higher return opportunities. It's the kind of decision you'd read about in a Harvard Business School case study. But there's another way to look at it. Caterpillar proved something really important with the Challenger program. They proved that innovation could come from outside an industry. They proved that a fresh perspective, someone who looked at an old problem with new eyes, could create a product that genuinely changed how people worked.
The tracked tractor concept wasn't new, but Caterpillar's execution of it with modern rubber track technology, that was genuinely innovative. And maybe the real legacy of the Challenger program isn't the tractors themselves. Maybe it's the idea that you can challenge conventional wisdom, that you can look at how things have always been done and ask, what if we did it differently? Today, if you drive through wheat country in Montana or soybean fields in North Dakota, you'll see tracked tractors everywhere. Some of them are Challengers, some of them are John Deeres, some of them are Cases. The technology Caterpillar pioneered has become mainstream. Farmers take it for granted now that rubber tracks are an option, that you can get the flotation benefits without the old crawler disadvantages. Soil compaction, that problem that seemed unsolvable back in the 80s, it's still a problem. But now farmers have tools to manage it, to minimize it, to protect their most valuable asset. And a big part of that is because Caterpillar, this construction equipment company, decided to try something different. So, yeah, Caterpillar exited agriculture. They sold the Challenger brand to AGCO and went back to focusing on dozers and excavators and mining trucks. But they left behind something bigger than a product line. They left behind a changed industry, one that took the lessons of the Challenger program and ran with them. And maybe that's the real story here. Not the business decision to exit, but the technical legacy that remains. The next time you see a compact tract loader on a construction site or a tracked tractor pulling a planter across a spring field, that's the Challenger program's ghost, still working, still proving that sometimes the outsider's perspective is exactly what an industry needs.